close your eyes and stands at your threshold, and suddenly you are not yourself, but some frightened creature, small and cornered, watching everything you thought solid begin to shimmer and dissolve. This is not the Hollywood romance of easy union, not the gentle merging of two complementary souls. This is love as psychic earthquake, love as the great unraveling, love as the force that threatens to tear down every carefully constructed wall between self and other, between known and unknown, between the person you have been and the person you might become. The ego, that faithful guardian of our constructed self, recognizes the scent of its own death on love's approaching wind. For what is deep intimacy but the gradual erosion of all boundaries? What is true union but the slow dissolution of the very fortress the ego has spent a lifetime building, stone by careful stone? In the architecture of the psyche, the ego serves as both builder and inhabitant, creating and then defending the structure it calls I, this collection of memories, preferences, fears, and dreams that forms the center of conscious experience. But love, authentic love, asks for something the ego cannot give without ceasing to be itself: surrender. Complete, unconditional, terrifying surrender. The beloved who stands before you is not merely another person. They are a living invitation to psychological death and rebirth, a doorway through which the familiar self must pass to be transformed into something unrecognizable. The ego, wise in its own limited way, senses this. It feels the pull of dissolution in every deep kiss, recognizes the threat of merger in every moment of true vulnerability. Where you might think you fear rejection, the ego knows better, fears acceptance so complete that it would be absorbed entirely, dissolved like salt in the vast ocean of another's being. Consider the fortress mind as it contemplates this approaching storm. Every relationship of depth becomes a siege upon the ego's carefully maintained autonomy. The beloved's love is received not as gift but as assault, not as blessing but as the slow acid that will eat away at everything the ego considers essential to survival. For survival, to the ego, means separation. It means maintaining the clear demarcation between self and world, between inner and outer, between the one who loves and the one who is loved. To remain intact, whole, uncompromised by the messy business of actually letting another being matter enough to change you. The ego has its reasons, and they are not without merit. Look back through the archaeology of your own becoming, and you will find there the accumulated wisdom of every wound, every betrayal, every moment when openness led to pain. The fortress was not built in paranoia, but in response to genuine assault. The walls went up because they were needed, because the soft creature within had learned that the world could be cruel to undefended hearts. In childhood, perhaps, when trust was met with abandonment. In adolescence, when vulnerability was rewarded with ridicule. In early love, when the opened heart was treated carelessly, left to bleed in the indifferent daylight of another's changing affection. These walls became home. These defenses became identity. The ego learned to find safety in distance, comfort in control, peace in the predictable loneliness of the well-defended self. And it served well, this fortress consciousness. It allowed you to function, to achieve, to present a coherent face to the world. It protected the tender core from further damage, created space for healing, provided the stable platform from which you could venture forth into life with some measure of confidence. But now, love arrives. And with it comes the terrible recognition that the very walls that saved you may now imprison you. The beloved approaches, and the ego sounds its alarms. Danger, invasion, dissolution. The same mechanisms that once protected, now prevent. The same boundaries that once healed, now separate you from the very connection your soul hungers for. The ego, faithful servant that it is, continues to protect you from what it perceives as threat. Unable to distinguish between the love that would destroy and the love that would transform. This is the great paradox of intimate relationship. What the heart most desires, the ego most fears. The beloved who could complete you is also the one who could obliterate you. The union that promises everything also threatens everything. Standing at love's threshold, the ego faces its ultimate enemy, not another person, but the possibility of change so profound that the self as it has known itself would cease to exist. And so the ego chooses, not consciously, not deliberately, but with the instinctive wisdom of self-preservation. It chooses the familiar pain of separation over the unknown territory of transformation. It chooses the controlled suffering of loneliness over the chaotic bliss of surrender. It chooses to remain itself, intact and isolated, rather than risk becoming something else entirely through the alchemical fire of true intimacy. Watch how it happens. Watch how the fortress consciousness responds to love's approach. Distance becomes strategy. Conflict becomes protection. The very beloved who holds the key to your transformation becomes the enemy from whom you must defend yourself, not because they are truly threatening, but because what they offer complete acceptance, unconditional love, the invitation to be fully seen and fully held, is precisely what the ego cannot survive. The beloved leaves, and the ego breathes its sigh of relief, never recognizing its own hand in the departure. The fortress remains intact, its walls unbreached, its isolation preserved, and you, the conscious witness of this inner drama, are left to wonder why love always seems to slip through your fingers, why connection feels impossible, why you seem doomed to repeat the same patterns of approach and retreat, intimacy and isolation. But perhaps, in the quiet moments after love's retreat, you can begin to hear another voice beneath the ego's reasonable explanations. Perhaps you can sense the presence of something larger than fear, something that understands that death and birth are not opposites, but partners in the same cosmic dance. Something that knows the fortress, however well built, cannot protect you from the one thing you actually need, the courage to love deeply enough to be transformed by it. The ego's fortress of independence stands still, its walls gleaming in the afternoon light of consciousness. But love, patient and persistent, continues its slow approach, knowing that eventually, inevitably, even the strongest walls must yield to the greater force of the heart's authentic longing for connection in the theater of the heart, where love performs its most exquisite deceptions. We become unwitting actors in a drama written by the unconscious itself. Here, in this sacred space where souls encounter one another, we discover that what we call love is often the most elaborate projection of our own inner landscape upon another human being. Watch closely as the curtain rises on this ancient play. There stands the beloved, radiant, mysterious, perfect in their imperfection. But look deeper, past the surface of attraction, past the sweet intoxication of new connection. What you see reflected in their eyes is not always their own essence, but the golden shadow of your unlived life, the disowned treasures of your own soul dressed in another's flesh. Jung knew this secret, that in love's first flowering, we are often loving not the person before us, but the parts of ourselves we have cast into exile. The shadow, that vast repository of everything we have deemed unacceptable about ourselves, finds in romantic love its most perfect stage. Here, it can dance freely, projecting itself upon the beloved with such intensity that we mistake our own psychological contents for the very essence of the other. How masterfully the psyche orchestrates this illusion. The qualities we find most magnetic in another are often those we have banished from our own self-concept. The free spirit we adore carries our own suppressed wildness. The gentle soul we cherish holds our own tenderness we dare not show. The confident being we worship mirrors back our own power we have learned to hide. In loving them, we love the exiled parts of ourselves, seeking reunion with our own wholeness through another's body and soul. This is the shadow's greatest gift and its deepest trap. For when we project our unlived life onto another, we transform them from a human being into a psychological container, a vessel meant to carry our own completeness. They become not a person in their own right, but the missing piece of our puzzle, the answer to our incompleteness, the key to our healing. But no human being can carry such weight. No mortal soul can be the repository for another's wholeness without eventually buckling under the pressure. The beloved, initially flattered by such intense devotion, begins to feel the crushing burden of being more than human. They sense, perhaps unconsciously, that they are not being loved for who they truly are, but for the psychological drama they have been forced to perform. In this moment, a terrible recognition dawns. The person we thought we loved begins to feel like a prisoner in our inner world, trapped by our need for them to remain perfect, to continue carrying our projections, to never reveal their human limitations, lest our fantasy crumble. They feel the weight of our unlived dreams, our unexpressed emotions, our disowned power pressing against their own authentic being. This is when the beloved often begins their retreat, not because our love is too little, but because it is too much of ourselves, too much of our own unprocessed material, too much of our own shadow dressed up as devotion. They flee not from love itself, but from the impossible task of being our psychological salvation. The shadow dance of projection reveals itself most clearly in these moments of departure. As the beloved begins to withdraw, pulling back from the intensity of our need, we often become desperate to maintain the projection. We pursue them with increasing fervor, unable to understand that our very pursuit drives them further away. We interpret their distance as rejection, their need for space as abandonment, their desire for autonomy as betrayal. But what is really happening is far more profound. The beloved is refusing to remain trapped in our inner drama. They are insisting on their own reality, their own shadow, their own incompleteness. They are demanding to be seen as they are, not as we need them to be. This refusal to carry our projections becomes the first invitation to real love that sees the other clearly, without the veils of our own psychological contents. Yet, before we can love truly, we must first retrieve our projections. We must call back the golden shadow we have cast upon them and reclaim it as our own. This is perhaps the most difficult work in all of human relationship, to take back what we have given away, to own what we have disowned, to become whole within ourselves rather than through another. The process is painful beyond measure. When we withdraw our projections, the beloved often loses their magical quality. They become human, again flawed, limited, imperfect. The transcendent love we felt transforms into something more ordinary, and we may mourn the loss of that sublime connection. But what we are really mourning is the loss of our illusions, the death of our psychological fantasy. This is why so many relationships end in this phase. Rather than do the difficult work of projection withdrawal, we often prefer to find a new beloved, upon whom we can cast our shadow once again. We repeat the pattern, creating phantom romance after phantom romance, always wondering why love never lasts, never understanding that what we call love is often the shadow's elaborate theater. Production, but for those brave enough to stay with the process, something miraculous awaits. When we finally reclaim our projections, when we stop asking another to carry our wholeness, when we cease demanding that they be our psychological salvation, space is created for real relationship. The beloved, no longer burdened by our shadow contents, can finally show us who they truly are. And we, no longer dependent on their reflection for our completeness, can finally love without the desperate need to possess or control. This is the paradox of projection. We must lose our phantom love to find real love. We must stop loving our own reflection in another's eyes to begin loving the mysterious other who stands before us. We must reclaim our shadow to set the beloved free, and in that freedom, discover the possibility of authentic connection. The shadow dance of projection is thus both love's greatest obstacle and its most profound teacher. It shows us how we use others as mirrors for our own inner world, and it demands that we take responsibility for our own psychological contents. Only when we stop projecting our unlived life onto another can we begin the real work of living it ourselves. Only when we cease demanding that others complete us can we discover what it means to love from wholeness rather than from need. This is the shadow's final lesson, that love begins not with finding the right person, but with becoming the right person, whole, integrated, responsible for our own completion, deep within the masculine psyche, in chambers so hidden that most men live entire lifetimes without glimpsing their existence, dwells the animate, eternal feminine principle that holds the keys to soul, to feeling, to the mysterious realm of the heart's deepest knowing. She is the inner woman who inhabits every man's unconscious, the repository of all that is receptive, intuitive, and creatively life-giving within the masculine soul. She is Sophia, the wise woman, Psyche, the soul herself, the ancient goddess, who remembers what the rational mind has forgotten, and within the feminine psyche lies her sacred counterpart, the animus, that divine masculine principle that carries the sword of discrimination, the fire of creative action, the capacity for focused will and spiritual authority. He is the inner masculine that every woman carries, the logos to her eros, the focused beam of consciousness that can cut through confusion and manifest vision into reality. He is the king, the warrior, the sagel, the focused masculine energies that complete the feminine soul's natural receptivity and flowing wisdom. These are Jung's great discovery, these contrasexual archetypes that live within each of us, these missing halves that seek completion not in another person, but in the integration of our own wholeness. Yet how rarely do we understand this profound truth when love strikes with archetypal force, awakening these sleeping giants from their unconscious slumber and projecting them with devastating intensity onto the beloved who stands before us. When love arrives bearing the signature of the numinous, when it carries that quality of the sacred that makes the ordinary world suddenly seem thin and transparent, we are in the presence of archetypal activation. The anima or animus has been stirred from its unconscious dwelling and begins to seek expression through the vessel of relationship. But here lies the great confusion, the tragic misunderstanding that leads to so much heartbreak and bewilderment in love's domain. The beloved who captures our heart with such overwhelming force may not be drawing us through their own personal qualities alone. More often, They have become the living embodiment of our own unlived psychological contents, the screen onto which we project our own inner completion. The man who falls helplessly in love may be encountering not the woman herself, but his own anima, dressed in her form, his own capacity for feeling, for intuition, for soulful connection that he has never learned to access within himself. The woman who experiences that soul-shaking recognition, that sense of having found her other half, may be meeting not her beloved's true essence, but her own animus, reflected back to her own power, her own strength, her own capacity for decisive action and spiritual authority that she has kept hidden in unconscious shadows, waiting for the right person to carry it for her. This is projection at its most powerful and most dangerous. When we mistake the carrier of our unconscious contents for our actual completion, when we demand that another person embody not only themselves but our own unlived potentials as well, the relationship becomes a kind of psychological vampirism, where we unconsciously feed off another's expression of what we refuse to develop within ourselves. The man projects his anima, and then wonders why his beloved seems so changeable, so moody, so impossible to understand, not recognizing that he is trying to relate to his own unconscious feminine through her, expecting her to be the container for all his unlived emotional and intuitive life. She becomes responsible not only for her own feeling nature, but for his as well. She must be his connection to beauty, to meaning, to the realm of the heart, a burden no human being can carry without eventually breaking under its impossible weight. The woman projects her animus, and then cannot understand why her partner seems so distant, so controlled, so unable to meet her need for strength and direction, not realizing that she is asking him to carry her own undeveloped masculine authority, her own capacity for decisive action and clear thinking. He becomes responsible not only for his own strength, but for hers as well. He must be her power in the world, her connection to focused will and creative manifestation, another impossible burden that crushes relationships under unrealistic expectations, when the projection becomes too intense, when the beloved can no longer bear the weight of carrying our unlived life, the relationship inevitably collapses. They begin to pull away, to retreat, to disappoint us in ways that feel like betrayal, but are actually the psyche's wise attempt to break the projection and return our disowned contents to where they belong within ourselves. The departure that feels like abandonment is often the unconscious wisdom of the psyche saying, "Enough. This person cannot be your anima. This person cannot be your animus. These qualities you seek so desperately in another are your own heritage, your own birthrights, your own unlived potentials that demand integration within your own being." The beloved who leaves when our love grows too intense may be unconsciously recognizing that they have become a prisoner in our psychological drama, a character in a story that has little to do with who they actually are, and everything to do with who we have never allowed ourselves to become. They flee not from our love, but from the suffocating weight of our projections, from the impossible demand that they be more than human, that they carry our completion as well as their own. In the aftermath of such departures, when the initial devastation begins to clear, we are left with love's greatest teaching, that the qualities we sought so desperately in another were never theirs to give. The feminine wisdom, the masculine strength, the soulful connection, the creative power, all of it lives within us, waiting not for the right person to awaken it, but for our own courage to claim it as our birthright. The anima calls us home, to our own capacity for feeling, for intuition, for receptive wisdom, The animus calls us home to our own strength, our own clarity, our own ability to act with focused intention. Love's apparent cruelty becomes love's greatest gift, the insistence that we become whole before we attempt to unite with another, that we integrate our task of being our psychological salvation. The shadow dance of projection reveals itself most clearly in these moments of departure. As the beloved begins to withdraw, pulling back from the intensity of our need, we often become desperate to maintain the projection. We pursue them with increasing fervor, unable to understand that our very pursuit drives them further away. We interpret their distance as rejection, their need for space as abandonment, their desire for autonomy as betrayal. But what is really happening is far more profound. The beloved is refusing to remain trapped in our inner drama. They are insisting on their own reality, their own shadow, their own incompleteness. They are demanding to be seen as they are, not as we need them to be. This refusal to carry our projections becomes the first invitation to real love that sees the other clearly, without the veils of our own psychological contents. Yet, before we can love truly, we must first retrieve our projections. We must call back the golden shadow we have cast upon them and reclaim it as our own. This is perhaps the most difficult work in all of human relationship, to take back what we have given away, to own what we have disowned, to become whole within ourselves rather than through another. The process is painful beyond measure. When we withdraw our projections, the beloved often loses their magical quality. They become human, again flawed, limited, imperfect. The transcendent love we felt transforms into something more ordinary, and we may mourn the loss of that sublime connection. But what we are really mourning is the loss of our illusions, the death of our psychological fantasy. This is why so many relationships end in this phase. Rather than do the difficult work of projection withdrawal, we often prefer to find a new beloved upon whom we can cast our shadow once again. We repeat the pattern, creating phantom romance after phantom romance, always wondering why love never lasts, never understanding that what we call love is often the shadow's elaborate theater. Production, but for those brave enough to stay with the process, something miraculous awaits. When we finally reclaim our projections, when we stop asking another to carry our wholeness, when we cease demanding that they be our psychological salvation, space is created for real relationship. The beloved, no longer burdened by our shadow contents, can finally show us who they truly are, and we, no longer dependent on their reflection for our completeness, can finally love without the desperate need to possess or control. This is the paradox of projection. We must lose our phantom love to find real love. We must stop loving our own reflection in another's eyes to begin loving the mysterious other who stands before us. We must reclaim our shadow to set the beloved free, and in their freedom, discover the possibility of authentic connection. The shadow dance of projection is thus both love's greatest obstacle and its most profound teacher. It shows us how we use others as mirrors for our own inner world, and it demands that we take responsibility for our own psychological contents. Only when we stop projecting our unlived life onto another can we begin the real work of living it ourselves. Only when we cease demanding that others complete us can we discover what it means to love from wholeness rather than from need. This is the shadow's final lesson, that love begins not with finding the right person, but with becoming the right person, whole, integrated, responsible for our own completion, deep within the masculine psyche, in chambers so hidden that most men live entire lifetimes without glimpsing their existence. dwells the animate, eternal feminine principle that holds the keys to soul, to feeling, to the mysterious realm of the heart's deepest knowing. She is the inner woman who inhabits every man's unconscious, the repository of all that is receptive, intuitive, and creatively life-giving within the masculine soul. She is Sophia, the wise woman, Psyche, the soul herself, the ancient goddess, who remembers what the rational mind has forgotten. And within the feminine psyche lies her sacred counterpart, the animus, that divine masculine principle that carries the sword of discrimination, the fire of creative action, the capacity for focused will and spiritual authority. He is the inner masculine that every woman carries, the logos to her eros, the focused beam of consciousness that can cut through confusion and manifest vision into reality. He is the king, the warrior, the sagel, the focused masculine energies that complete the feminine soul's natural receptivity and flowing wisdom. These are Jung's great discovery, these contrasexual archetypes that live within each of us, these missing halves that seek completion not in another person, but in the integration of our own wholeness. Yet how rarely do we understand this profound truth when love strikes with archetypal force, awakening these sleeping giants from their unconscious slumber and projecting them with devastating intensity onto the beloved who stands before us. When love arrives bearing the signature of the numinous, when it carries that quality of the sacred that makes the ordinary world suddenly seem thin and transparent, we are in the presence of archetypal activation. The anima or animus has been stirred from its unconscious dwelling and begins to seek expression through the vessel of relationship. But here lies the great confusion, the tragic misunderstanding that leads to so much heartbreak and bewilderment in love's domain. The beloved who captures our heart with such overwhelming force may not be drawing us through their own personal qualities alone. More often, they have become the living embodiment of our own unlived psychological contents, the screen onto which we project our own inner completion. The man who falls helplessly in love may be encountering not the woman herself, but his own anima, dressed in her form, his own capacity for feeling, for intuition, for soulful connection that he has never learned to access within himself. The woman who experiences that soul-shaking recognition, that sense of having found her other half, may be meeting not her beloved's true essence, but her own animus, reflected back to her own power, her own strength, her own capacity for decisive action and spiritual authority that she has kept hidden in unconscious shadows, waiting for the right person to carry it for her. This is projection at its most powerful and most dangerous. When we mistake the carrier of our unconscious contents for our actual completion, when we demand that another person embody not only themselves but our own unlived potentials as well, the relationship becomes a kind of psychological vampirism, where we unconsciously feed off another's expression of what we refuse to develop within ourselves. The man projects his anima, and then wonders why his beloved seems so changeable, so moody, so impossible to understand, not recognizing that he is trying to relate to his own unconscious feminine through her, expecting her to be the container for all his unlived emotional and intuitive life. She becomes responsible not only for her own feeling nature, but for his as well. She must be his connection to beauty, to meaning, to the realm of the heart, a burden no human being can carry without eventually breaking under its impossible weight. The woman projects her animus, and then cannot understand why her partner seems so distant, so controlled, so unable to meet her need for strength and direction, not realizing that she is asking him to carry her own undeveloped masculine authority, her own capacity for decisive action and clear thinking. He becomes responsible, not only for his own strength, but for hers as well. He must be her power in the world, her connection to focused will and creative manifestation, another impossible burden that crushes relationships under unrealistic expectations, when the projection becomes too intense, when the beloved can no longer bear the weight of carrying our unlived life. The relationship inevitably collapses. They begin to pull away, to retreat, to disappoint us in ways that feel like betrayal, but are actually the psyche's wise attempt to break the projection and return our disowned contents to where they belong within ourselves. The departure that feels like abandonment is often the unconscious wisdom of the psyche saying, "Enough. This person cannot be your anima. This person cannot be your animus. These qualities you seek so desperately in another are your own heritage, your own birthrights, your own unlived potentials that demand integration within your own being." The beloved who leaves when our love grows too intense may be unconsciously recognizing that they have become a prisoner in our psychological drama, a character in a story that has little to do with who they actually are, and everything to do with who we have never allowed ourselves to become. They flee not from our love, but from the suffocating weight of our projections, from the impossible demand that they be more than human, that they carry our completion as well as their own. In the aftermath of such departures, when the initial devastation begins to clear, we are left with love's greatest teaching, that the qualities we sought so desperately in another were never theirs to give. The feminine wisdom, the masculine strength, the soulful connection, the creative power, all of it lives within us, waiting not for the right person to awaken it, but for our own courage to claim it as our birthright. The anima calls us home, to our own capacity for feeling, for intuition, for receptive wisdom. The animus calls us home to our own strength, our own clarity, our own ability to act with focused intention. Love's apparent cruelty becomes love's greatest gift, the insistence that we become whole before we attempt to unite with another, that we integrate out any longer behind the comfortable fiction of who we thought we were. The shadow, that aspect of ourselves we have worked so hard to deny, recognizes in this moment its moment of potential liberation. All the parts of ourselves we have deemed unacceptable, unlovable, wrong, they rise to the surface in love's revealing light. The anger we pretend not to feel, the neediness we have taught ourselves to disguise as independence, the deep aching loneliness that no amount of success or achievement has been able to heal, the child within who still cries for the love that was promised but never quite received. To be seen in this completeness is to risk everything. It is to risk discovering that we are, in fact, as broken as we feared. It is to risk finding out that even love, authentic love, might not be enough to heal the fundamental brokenness we sense at our core. It is to risk the ultimate rejection, not of our false self, but of our true self, not of our mask, but of the face beneath the mask. Watch how the psyche responds to this threat of complete visibility. The same mechanisms that once protected us from emotional harm now activate to protect us from emotional healing. The walls go up, not against attack, but against acceptance. The defenses marshal themselves not to repel criticism, but to resist the unbearable intimacy of being loved for exactly who we are. In all our imperfection and contradiction and beautiful, terrible humanity, the beloved becomes, in this moment, not the answer to our prayers but the embodiment of our deepest fear. They hold up a mirror in which we see ourselves without the flattering angles. without the careful lighting, without the strategic cropping we have perfected over years of self-presentation. In their eyes, we are forced to confront, not the idealized version of ourselves we have been trying to become, but the actual person we have always been wounded and healing, wise and foolish, generous and selfish, often simultaneously. This is why authenticity in love can feel like a kind of death. The self we have spent a lifetime constructing, protecting, and presenting begins to dissolve in the solvent of another's complete acceptance. The elaborate edifice of who we thought we should be crumbles before the simple reality of who we actually are. And for those unprepared for such radical honesty, for such fundamental reconstruction of identity, flight becomes the only option that feels like survival. The departure, when it comes, may be dressed in other clothes. Perhaps it manifests sudden anger, as though the beloved has somehow betrayed us by seeing too clearly. Perhaps it appears as criticism, as though their loving attention has somehow become intrusion. Their acceptance somehow become judgment. Perhaps it takes the form of sudden unavailability, busyness, the creation of distance through the accumulation of obligations and distractions. But beneath all these surface explanations lies the deeper truth. We are fleeing not from the beloved rejection, but from their acceptance. Not from their inability to love us, but from their terrible, wonderful ability to love us exactly as we are. We run not from their blindness, but from their sight. Not from their cruelty, but from their compassion that threatens to heal us in ways we are not yet ready to be healed. The shadow whispers its ancient wisdom. Better to be alone and hidden than loved and revealed. Better to maintain the carefully constructed self in solitude than risk its dissolution in the fire of authentic intimacy. Better to know ourselves partially and privately than to discover ourselves completely in the mirror of another's loving gaze. And so we choose the familiar darkness of concealment over the unknown territory of transparency. We choose the controlled loneliness of the hidden self over the chaotic vulnerability of being fully known. We retreat to the safety of our own partial self-knowledge, leaving behind the beloved who dared to see us, hold in the silence that follows love's departure. Perhaps we can begin to hear another voice, the voice of the self that knows we are already whole, already worthy, already deserving of the very love we have been too frightened to receive. The voice that understands that being seen completely is not annihilation, but liberation. Not death, but birth into the fullness of our own authentic being. Dight deep within the collective unconscious, in that vast ocean of shared human experience that connects all souls across time, their lives a wound so ancient and so profound that it shapes the very architecture of how we love. This is the sacred wound of abandonment, the primal separation that marks the beginning of individual consciousness. The original trauma of being cast out from the divine wholeness into the stark reality of separate existence. Listen closely, and you can hear its echo in every human heart. It is the memory written in our cells, the archetypal pattern that weaves itself through every story of love and loss. It whispers of that first moment when the child discovers they are not one with the mother, when the soul realizes it must exist apart from the source that gave it life. This is not merely personal history, this is the wound of consciousness itself. The price we pay for becoming individual beings capable of love. In the mythology of our species, this abandonment takes many forms. It is Eve's exile from Eden, the soul's fall from grace. It is the child's banishment from the eternal mother's embrace. It is Persephone's descent into the underworld, separated from Demeter's nurturing presence. These are not mere stories, they are the psychological blueprints that live within us. the archetypal templates through which we experience every subsequent separation, every loss, every moment when love withdraws its warming light, when love approaches in our adult lives, drawing near with its promise of reunion and wholeness. It may inadvertently awaken the sleeping giant of ancient trauma. The very intimacy we crave becomes the trigger for our deepest fear. As the beloved moves closer, as the walls between hearts begin to dissolve, something primal within us remembers the original abandonment. The unconscious begins to whisper its familiar warnings. This closeness will end. This love will leave. You will be cast out again, just as you were before. Watch how the pattern unfolds in love's theater. The beloved, sensing this ancient terror, stirring in the depths, may begin to feel an inexplicable restlessness. They cannot name what frightens them, cannot understand why intimacy itself has become the source of their unease. They only know that something within them is crying out for distance, for the familiar safety of solitude, for the protective walls they have spent a lifetime building. This is the shadow of our collective human story playing out its eternal drama. The one who flees may not be rejecting present love, but rather protecting themselves from the reenactment of that primordial pain. Their departure becomes not a conscious choice, but a compulsive response to an archetypal pattern that runs deeper than personal memory, deeper than individual experience. Jung revealed this profound truth that we are unconsciously drawn to recreate our deepest wounds until they can be transformed into wisdom. The abandonment wound does not seek to punish us. It seeks to be healed. But healing requires conscious participation, and most often we find ourselves trapped in unconscious repetition instead. The beloved leaves because leaving feels safer than staying, because the familiar ache of chosen solitude seems preferable to the risk of being abandoned against their will. In this moment of departure, both lovers become actors in an ancient play whose script was written long before their personal stories began. The one who is left experiences the full force of the original wound, the terror of being unloved, unwanted, cast out from the garden of connection. The one who leaves carries their own version of the same trauma, the fear of being left, which compels them to leave first, to control the narrative of abandonment rather than be its victim. But see how the wound serves a sacred purpose. This is not mere cruelty dressed as love. This is the psyche's attempt to bring consciousness to what has remained unconscious. Each reenactment of abandonment offers an opportunity for the wound to be witnessed, felt fully, and ultimately transformed. The pain we experience is not just personal grief, is the collective sorrow of humanity touching the edge of its own healing. The one who flees is not our enemy, but our teacher, showing us through their absence what we have always known, but never fully felt, that we came into this world alone and must learn to find wholeness within ourselves. Their departure forces us to confront the abandonment wound directly, to feel its full weight without the buffer of another's presence to distract us from its message. In the depths of this sacred wound lies a terrible and beautiful truth, that we are always both the abandoned child and the abandoning parent, the one who is left and the one who leaves. We carry within us both sides of the archetypal pattern. We flee from intimacy because we fear abandonment, and in our flight, we abandon others. We crave connection to heal our wound, and yet connection itself triggers the very wound we seek. To heal, this is the paradox that lives at the heart of human love, that our deepest desire and our greatest fear spring from the same source. The wound of abandonment creates both our capacity for love and our terror of it. It drives us toward others with desperate need and drives us away with equal force. It is both the poison and the medicine, the curse and the blessing. Yet within this wound lies the seed of transformation. When we can finally turn toward the abandonment rather than away from it, when we can embrace the abandoned child within ourselves rather than demanding that others heal it for us, something miraculous occurs. The wound begins to reveal its sacred purpose. It has not come to destroy us, but to initiate us into a deeper understanding of what it means to be human. The beloved who leaves is thus not our tormentor, but our guide, leading us back to the original wound so that it might finally be seen, felt, and integrated. Their absence becomes the space in which we can finally meet the abandoned child within ourselves, with the love they have always needed. We discover that what we thought we needed from another, we can learn to give to ourselves. This is the shadow's greatest gift disguised as its cruelest punishment. The recognition that every abandonment is also an invitation to come home to ourselves, to heal the ancient wound through our own conscious, loving presence. In learning to tend our own abandonment with compassion, we discover that we were never truly abandoned at all. We were simply called to remember that love's true source lies not outside ourselves, but within the very wound we thought would destroy us. In the ancient laboratories of the alchemists, where lead was transformed into gold and base matter, elevated into spiritual essence, there existed a sacred understanding that all true transformation must begin with dissolution. They called this first stage negredo, the blackening, the necessary descent into primordial darkness where all form dissolves back into the prima materia, the original chaos from which new creation can emerge. The medieval alchemists, those spiritual scientists who understood that outer transformation was always a reflection of inner change, knew that before any substance could be purified and elevated, it must first be broken down completely. The vessel must be heated until its contents turn black, until all familiar structures dissolve into an undifferentiated mass of potential. Only in this dark phase, this apparent destruction, could the work of true transformation begin. Jung recognized in these ancient practices a profound map of psychological transformation, a symbolic language that described with startling accuracy the process by which the human psyche undergoes its own metamorphosis. And nowhere is this alchemical wisdom more relevant than in understanding why love's intensity sometimes triggers not union but dissolution, not deeper connection but the apparent destruction of everything we held dear. When love arrives with overwhelming force, when its demands for authenticity and vulnerability threaten to dissolve the careful structures of our defended self, the psyche may respond not by opening further but by initiating its own negredo. Like the wise alchemist who knows that transformation requires breakdown, the unconscious may orchestrate the very dissolution we fear most, the departure of the beloved, the collapse of the relationship, the return to the dark solitude where deep change becomes possible. The beloved's leaving is not, in this deeper understanding, a failure of love, but rather love's own alchemical wisdom at work. The intensity that we experienced as the height of connection may have been signaling to the unconscious that transformation was needed, not just adjustment or compromise, but a fundamental dissolution and reconstitution of identity itself. And such profound change cannot happen within the familiar container of relationship. It requires the crucible of solitude, the laboratory of the isolated soul. This is the dark night of the soul that mystics have written about for centuries. The negredo phase, where all that we thought we were must die before what we truly are can be born. In love's context, this death is not metaphorical but devastatingly reality. death of our identity as beloved, as chosen, as worthy of another's presence and devotion. The death of our carefully constructed notion of who we are in relationship, who we are when reflected in another's eyes, who we are when we have someone to love and be loved by in return. The ego, encountering this dissolution, experiences it initially as the ultimate catastrophe. Everything it has worked to build, the connection, the intimacy, the shared future, the sense of being known and accepted, crumbles into ash. The familiar landmarks of identity disappear into darkness. The comfortable roles and patterns that defined us in relationship dissolve into formless chaos. We find ourselves in the alchemical nigredo, where all is black, all is confusion, all is apparent loss. Yet the ancient wisdom understands that this blackening is not punishment, but preparation. Not failure, but the necessary first stage of profound transformation. Just as the alchemist knows that the vessel must be heated until its contents turn to ash before the purification can begin. The soul recognizes that certain transformations require complete breakdown before breakthrough becomes possible. In this dark phase, we are stripped of all external sources of identity and validation. The beloved who once reflected our worth back to us is gone. The relationship that once defined our purpose and direction has ended. The future we had imagined has vanished into uncertainty. We are left alone with the raw material of our being, forced to confront who we are when all external scaffolding has been removed. This is the bitter medicine of the nigredo, the recognition that everything we thought was solid and permanent was actually temporary and conditional. The devastating awareness that the love we believed was eternal was actually serving the deeper purpose of transformation, bringing us to this point of necessary dissolution where real change becomes possible for the first time. The alchemists understood that the vessel itself must sometimes be broken in order for its contents to be properly transformed. Some substances could only be purified through complete destruction of their containing form. And so it is with certain souls, certain relationships, certain phases of our development. The old container must shatter completely before the new. One can be forged in love's alchemical crucible. We discover that the departure we experienced as rejection was actually the unconscious wisdom of the psyche protecting the sacred process of individuation. The beloved could not remain because their presence would have prevented the necessary dissolution. We could not transform while still clinging to the familiar forms of connection. The nigredo demanded solitude, demanded the complete breakdown of external supports, demanded the terrifying freedom of standing alone with nothing but our essential being. This dark phase brings gifts that no other stage of transformation can provide. In the blackness, we learn to generate our own light. In the solitude, we discover our own capacity for companionship. In the absence of external validation, we develop the ability to recognize our own worth, the very qualities we sought from. The departed beloved love, acceptance, understanding, devotion we are forced to cultivate within ourselves. The nigredo teaches us that some vessels are meant to be temporary. Some relationships exist solely to bring us to the point where deeper transformation becomes necessary. The beloved who leaves is often serving love's highest purpose, not the love that seeks comfort and continuity, but the love that demands growth, that insists on our becoming all that we are capable of becoming, even when that process requires the apparent destruction of everything we hold dear. In this alchemical understanding, the departure becomes sacred, the dissolution becomes purposeful. The dark night becomes the laboratory where our lead is slowly, mysteriously, inevitably transformed into gold. We learn to honor the nigredo, not as failure, but as the necessary first movement in love's deepest symphony, the dissolution that precedes integration, the death that makes rebirth possible, the darkness that gives birth to a light that no external circumstance can ever extinguish. In the depths of his exploration into the mysterious workings of the human psyche, Carl Jung discovered a principle so fundamental, so universally present, in the movements of consciousness, that he gave it an ancient Greek name, enantiodromia, the running counter to the sacred law by which all psychic energy, when it reaches the extremity of its expression, transforms inevitably into its opposite. This is not mere philosophical concept, but living truth, observable in the great cycles of nature, in the rhythm of seasons, in the pulse of breath itself. The tide that reaches its highest point must turn and flow back toward the sea. The pendulum that swings to its furthest arc must surrender to gravity's call and return. The heart that beats in systole must release into diastole. The eternal dance of expansion and contraction that sustains all life in love's sacred realm. This ancient principle reveals itself with both beauty and terror, manifesting as a wisdom so profound that it often appears as cruelty to those who do not understand its deeper purpose. When devotion reaches overwhelming intensity, when care becomes so complete it borders on suffocation, when closeness grows so intimate that individual boundaries begin to dissolve, the psyche responds not with grateful surrender, but with an automatic correction that can feel like betrayal. The beloved, who seemed to want nothing more than complete union, suddenly pulls back, creates distance, seems to transform overnight from lover to stranger. What has occurred is not a failure of love, but the activation of love's own protective mechanism, the unconscious wisdom that recognizes when love's energy has become so concentrated, so intense, that it threatens to consume the very individuals it seeks to unite. This is enantiodromia in its most intimate expression, the moment when too much togetherness breeds the desperate need for separateness, when too much care transforms into the requirement for neglect, when too much understanding creates the hunger for mystery. The beloved's retreat follows this natural rhythm of the psyche. This ancient law that knows balance must be restored before love can destroy what it seeks to preserve. To witness this transformation is to observe consciousness itself, seeking equilibrium, the soul's innate wisdom asserting itself against love's beautiful but potentially destructive excess. The same energy that drew two hearts together with magnetic force now repels them with equal intensity. Not because love has died, but because love has grown. So powerful, it must be temporarily scattered to prevent it from consuming both participants. Entirely Jung understood that the psyche operates according to laws as immutable as those governing the physical universe. Just as energy in the material world seeks balance and distribution, psychic energy must find its own equilibrium or risk, creating conditions that threaten the very structures it inhabits. When love becomes too concentrated, too focused, too exclusive of all other aspects of existence, the unconscious mind responds with what appears to be its opposite, but is actually its complement. This is why the beloved, who was once unable to bear separation, suddenly craves solitude. Why the heart that seemed to want nothing but closeness now requires distance to breathe. The same soul that once found meaning only in union now discovers that meaning requires the tension of separation to remain vital, dynamic, alive. What appears as cruel abandonment may be consciousness itself, seeking the breathing space necessary for love to renew and regenerate itself. The dance of opposites that emerges departure and return, closeness and distance, presence and absence mirrors the eternal breathing of the soul itself. Just as the lungs must empty to fill again, just as the heart must relax between beats, love itself must experience the rhythm of separation and reunion to maintain its vitality. Without this natural ebb and flow, love stagnates, becomes heavy, loses the very qualities that made it precious in the first place. Enantiandromia teaches us that what we resist or fear as love's opposite may actually be love's essential partner, the shadow that gives love its shape and meaning. Distance makes reunion possible. Absence creates the space where longing can grow. Separation provides the tension that keeps love dynamic rather than static, alive rather than preserved, like a flower pressed between the pages of memory. The beloved who enacts this principle often does so unconsciously, driven by forces they neither understand nor control. They may experience their own withdrawal as inexplicable, even unwanted, yet find themselves powerless to resist the tide that carries them away from what they thought they wanted most. They become instruments of love's own deeper wisdom, agents of the very force that seeks to preserve what excessive closeness might otherwise destroy. This is perhaps the most difficult aspect of an enantiodromia to accept, that love itself may orchestrate its own temporary denial, that the heart may engineer its own breaking in service of a wholeness too large for the conscious mind to grasp. The beloved becomes both perpetrator and victim of love's own protective mechanism, simultaneously choosing and being chosen by forces that operate beyond personal will or desire. Yet within this apparent contradiction lies profound hope. If love can transform into separation through natural law, then separation can transform back into love through the same principle. The energy that created distance will eventually reverse itself. The pendulum that swung toward isolation will find its way back toward connection. This is not guarantee, but possibility. The recognition that enantiodromia works in both directions. That what appears lost may be preparing to return in new form. The beloved who seems to have vanished entirely may be gathering themselves in solitude's chamber, allowing love's energy to transform and renew itself in the darkness of separation. They may be unconsciously honoring the rhythm that knows reunion is only possible when the hunger for connection has been renewed by the experience of its absence. Understanding enantiodromia does not eliminate love's pain, but provides context for its necessity. It reveals departure not as failure, but as part of love's own larger design. Separation not as ending, but as love's way of preparing space for its own return. In this cosmic breathing of approach and withdrawal, presence and absence, we glimpse the eternal dance through which all energy, including love's energy, maintains its vitality and continues its endless transformation. The beloved who leaves following this ancient law carries within them the seeds of return. For the same force that created separation contains the potential for reunion. In love's realm, as in all of nature's expressions, every ending contains the promise of new beginning, every departure the possibility of deeper return. In the hollow silence that follows love's retreat, something unexpected begins to stir. Where once there was the beloved's presence, now there is space vast, echoing, initially terrifying in its emptiness. But listen closely and you will hear it, the sound of your own breath, your own heartbeat, the quiet rustle of your soul, beginning to unfurl in solitude's cathedral. The departure that felt like devastation reveals itself, slowly and with infinite tenderness, as an invitation written in the ancient script of return. This is the great homecoming that arrives disguised as abandonment. The beloved's absence, which seemed to tear a hole in the fabric of your existence, has instead created a sacred vacancia, clearing in the dense forest of projection and expectation. A still pool where your own reflection can finally be seen, without the distortion of another's presence rippling across its surface. Here, in the aftermath of what felt like loss, the real work begins. The gathering back of all the pieces of yourself you had unknowingly given away for what is romantic. Love, in its unconscious form, but a magnificent act of projection. We take the unlived parts of our own psyche, our capacity for joy, our potential for wholeness, our ability to feel complete, and we cast them like golden nets upon another soul, asking them to carry what we have forgotten how to carry ourselves. The beloved becomes the repository of our own undeveloped divinity, the screen upon which we project the movie of our own potential transformation. But projection, however beautiful, is always temporary. What we cast out must eventually be drawn back in. What we give away must ultimately be reclaimed. The beloved's departure, painful as it feels, serves a function more profound than mere human drama. It creates the psychic vacuum, necessary for the return of these scattered parts of self, like iron filings drawn to a magnet. The projected aspects of our being begin their journey home. In the initial stages of this return, the experience may feel like disintegration rather than integration. You reach for the beloved and find only empty air. You seek their validation and encounter only silence. You call upon their presence to complete you and discover, with mounting panic, that completion must come from elsewhere, or perhaps from nowhere at all in the external world. This is the dark night of the ego, the moment when all external sources of meaning seem to drain away, leaving you face to face with the terrifying question, who are you when no one else is watching? But slowly, if you can resist the urge to flee back into the familiar pattern of seeking another to fill the void, something extraordinary begins to happen. The very qualities you adored in the beloved, their wisdom, their compassion, their capacity for joy, begin to emerge from within your own being, not as imitation or compensation, but as recognition, as remembrance, as the gradual awakening to the truth that what you loved in them was always a reflection of your own unlived potential. This is the alchemy of solitude, the transformation of lead into gold, of loss into discovery, of emptiness into fullness. The space where the beloved once stood becomes a workshop for the soul, a laboratory where the scattered mercury of your fragmented self can be gathered and reconstituted into the gold of integrated being. Each memory of what you loved in them becomes a clue to what lies dormant within you. Each quality you admired becomes a map leading back to your own buried treasure. The process is not gentle. To reclaim what we have projected requires us to face the uncomfortable truths of our own completeness. Completeness we have spent years, perhaps decades, denying through our desperate seeking of external fulfillment. It requires us to acknowledge that the love we thought could only come from another has been flowing within our own being all along, like an underground river waiting to be discovered. Jung called this the individuation process, the long journey of becoming who we truly are, rather than who we think we should be. It is the work of a lifetime, this gathering back of the self from all the places we have scattered it in our search for love, meaning, and completion. The beloved's departure accelerates this process, creating a crisis that forces us to find internally what we have been seeking externally. In the silence of your own company, you begin to notice things that were obscured by the beloved's presence. The way your own intuition speaks when it is not competing with another's voice. The particular quality of your own laughter when it is not performing for an audience. the specific texture of your own thoughts when they are not constantly measuring themselves against another's expectations, the unique rhythm of your own desires when they are not constantly adapting to accommodate another's needs. This is not the loneliness you feared, but the solitude you have been unconsciously seeking. This is not abandonment, but arrival at the home within yourself that has been waiting patiently for your return all along. The beloved's absence creates the space necessary for your own presence to fill the room, completely, without apology, without compromise, without the constant editing that relationship sometimes requires. Here, in this sacred aloneness, you discover the eternal beloved within, not as concept or metaphor, but as lived reality. The source of unconditional love that you sought in another reveals itself to have been flowing within your own heart all along. The acceptance you craved from external sources emerges from the depths of your own being. The completion you thought required another soul turns out to be available through the simple act of fully inhabiting your own. This is the gift wrapped in grief, the fierce compassion that love sometimes shows by departing, for only in the beloved's absence can you discover that you were never truly incomplete. Only in losing the external source of love can you find the eternal wellspring within. Only in facing the terror of aloneness can you discover the joy of all-oneness, the unity with yourself that is the foundation of all genuine relationship. The departure that seemed to diminish you reveals itself as an expansion. The loss that felt like death becomes a birth. The ending that broke your heart becomes the beginning of your heart's true education. The learning that you are, and have always been, your own first and final love. This is the return to the self, not as consolation prize for love's failure, but as the recognition that love's deepest purpose was always to lead you home to your own indivisible wholeness. From the ashes of love's destruction, something miraculous stirs. It is not the resurrection of what was, but the birth of what has never been, a phoenix rising from the funeral pyre of our former ways of loving, transformed by the very flames that we thought would consume us forever. This is not the same naive heart that loved with desperate need and lost with devastating grief. This is consciousness itself, purified by separation's sacred fire, tempered in the crucible of solitude, and reborn into a love that knows both its power and its proper limits. Watch as this transformed heart emerges from the depths of its own mourning. It carries within its very essence the wisdom that can only be earned through departure's harsh teaching. It has learned what the untested heart cannot comprehend, that true intimacy is not the merger of two incomplete beings seeking wholeness through the other, but the conscious choice of two already complete souls to share their fullness without losing themselves in the sharing. That this phoenix of renewed love no longer burns with the frantic hunger that once drove it to possess, to control, to make another responsible for its happiness. The fire that destroyed its illusions has also burned away its desperate need to be saved by love. In its place rises something far more precious, the capacity to love without grasping, to give without depleting, to receive without demanding. The departure that once felt like the end of all possibility reveals itself now as love's most compassionate teacher. What seemed like cruelty was actually midwifery, the painful but necessary process of bringing forth a love that transcends the ego's narrow understanding of what relationship should be. The beloved who left was not our enemy but our liberator, freeing us from the prison of possessive attachment and opening the door to a love beyond the reach of loss. Here, in this sacred space of transformed loving, we discover that relationship itself can become a spiritual practice rather than an emotional refuge. Each interaction becomes an opportunity for consciousness to know itself more deeply through the mirror of another's being. We no longer seek to lose ourselves in love, but to find ourselves more completely through loving. We approach the beloved, not as savior, but as fellow traveler on the path of awakening. This renewed love carries within it a fierce tenderness that only those who have journeyed through love's dark night can know. It is tender because it has felt the full weight of vulnerability, the exquisite pain of caring deeply in a world where all things pass away. It is fierce because it has looked directly into the face of impermanence and chosen to love anyway, not despite the fact that everything changes, but because of it. The heart that has known departure and return, separation and reunion, loves now with a quality that is both more gentle and more powerful than anything it knew before. It has discovered that love's true strength lies not in its ability to hold on to what it cherishes, but in its willingness to let go when letting go serves love itself. It has learned to trust the mysterious intelligence that moves through all relationships, guiding them through seasons of closeness and distance, union and separation, according to a wisdom far greater than our personal desires. This phoenix love no longer mistakes intensity for depth, passion for permanence, or possession for protection. It understands that the deepest connections are often the most spacious, allowing room for each being to grow and change without demanding that they remain frozen in the forms that once pleased us. It has discovered that true intimacy flourishes, not in the heat of desperate need, but in the clear light of conscious choice. See how this transformed heart approaches relationship now. It brings to love not emptiness seeking to be filled, but fullness seeking to be shared. It offers not dependence disguised as devotion, but the gift of one complete being, choosing to walk alongside another complete being. It understands that the most profound union occurs not when to become one, but when to remain fully themselves while dancing together in the space between. This is love as spiritual. Alchemy, the conscious transformation of base emotional reactions into the gold of genuine caring. Where once there was possessiveness, now there is appreciation. Where once there was fear of loss, now there is gratitude for whatever time is given. Where once there was the demand for permanence, now there is the wisdom to cherish what is temporary. While it lasts, the phoenix of renewed love has glimpsed love's deepest mystery, that we must be willing to lose everything to gain what cannot be lost. It has discovered that what we think of as love is often just attachment wearing love's mask, and that real love is the willingness to want what is best for the beloved, even when what is best for them is not what we prefer for ourselves. This is the love that survives departure because it was never dependent on presence. It is the love that grows stronger through separation because it finds its source not in the other, but in the depths of its own being. It is the love that can let go without stopping to love, that can say goodbye without saying goodbye to love itself. In this renewal, we discover that every ending was also a beginning, every loss a gain in wisdom, every departure a deeper return to what love actually is beneath all our stories about what it should be. The beloved who left taught us the most precious lesson, that love does not require possession to exist, that caring does not need control to flourish, that the heart's true freedom lies in its ability to love without conditions, without guarantees, without the promise of forever. This phoenix rises not to reclaim what was lost, but to embody what was gained, a recognition that love itself can never be lost because it was never something we possessed. It was always something we were, something we are, something that exists in the very fabric of consciousness itself. The departure revealed this truth by stripping away everything that was not love, leaving only love's essential nature shining in the darkness. And so the phoenix spreads its wings of renewed understanding, ready to love again, not as the naive heart once loved, but as consciousness loves freely, fearlessly, without attachment to outcome, with complete presence to what is. This is love's true resurrection, not the return to what was, but the emergence of what has always been waiting beneath our small ideas about how love should behave.